to session 9 of what's going to end up being 11 sessions of our eschatology class. This week we'll be discussing the little horn GOG and the Assyrian, aka the Antichrist. This will be fun because a lot of what we're doing here in this class is really looking at our Old Testament foundations for what we know to be true about the end times. There's a lot of prophecies that include a lot of qualifications and criteria for who can be the Antichrist and where he comes from and what his empire looks like and where they come from. And so I'd love to entertain all of the crazy theories out there and talk about, what they are, why they're not true, and things like that. But like in the beginning, we're going to study what we know to be true. We're going to learn what that dollar bill really looks like, so that when you move on from this class and you see a fake one, a counterfeit, it'll stand out to you. So for today, we're going to be looking at geographically where specifically the Antichrist will come from. And it's amazing. It's abundantly clear. There's a ton of evidence in the Old Testament for where he'll come from, lots of prototypes. What we'll find is that the Bible's been telling the same story. The prophets have been giving prophecies about the same story over and over. It's not a bunch of fractured, different prophecies about different people and different wars and empires. It's the same prophecies about the same empire and the same coming Antichrist and the same coming Messiah who's going to rescue Israel and judge the nations and the Antichrist and establish his kingdom. And the knowledge of the Lord will overflow as the water covers the sea, as it says in Isaiah. So anyway, this morning we're going to start with looking at the return of Jesus, and when he returns in the context of the day of the Lord, what nations are marked out for judgment at that time when Jesus comes back. And so we all understand that in the end there will be a coalition of nations, primarily 10 nations, that will make up the Antichrist Empire, that will attack Jerusalem. They'll carry off the Israelites into exile. All these terrible things. Israel's going to go through the time of Jacob's trouble in this period, and then the Messiah returns and he physically rescues Israel, and the Battle of Armageddon and the deliverance and all these things in the establishment of the millennial kingdom. And so in the context of those passages where it describes the Messiah coming to rescue Israel, it also talks about what nations or what people groups are going to be judged at that time. So that should key us in. This is really important geographically, who the prophets are talking to, because not only are they talking to the nations that surround them at the time of their prophecy, but they're looking forward and prophesying about these same peoples in the same geographical area that will be there at the end time. So the question is, what specific nations are reserved for judgment on the day of the Lord regarding their perpetual enmity towards Israel? Now let's remember Genesis 3:15, where Jesus says, I will put enmity between you, that being Satan, and the woman, being Eve, between your offspring and her offspring. So we see that this enmity between the offspring of Satan and the offspring of Eve, which would be the righteous, is going to be perpetual, and it's going to carry on till the end, when finally the Messiah crushes the head of Satan, right? And so as part of the criteria for being that end times empire, it's not just geographically where they're located, but they also have to have that same satanically fueled hatred for the Jewish people and Christians who've been grafted into Israel, and an obsession over the land of Israel and Jerusalem in particular, because that's the place of the Messiah's throne. So as a recurring theme, beginning in Genesis and extending through the prophets, the peoples and nations afflicting Israel in the context of the day of the Lord are repeatedly named. These peoples and nations make up the heart of the empire of the Antichrist. So the first passage we're going to look at is Numbers 24. If you remember in the book of Numbers, Israel is moving up through the desert, and they are headed towards the promised land. And Balak, one of the kings of the nations that are occupying that land, hires Balaam, a prophet, to prophesy to curse Israel as they're moving through the land. Remember that? This is a story where Balaam is on his donkey, and he's trying to go off to curse Israel, and he's confronted by the angel of the Lord, who we know to be Jesus, on the road. Only the problem is Balaam doesn't see him, but his donkey does. And so he's standing there with a flaming sword, and the donkey doesn't want to go past him. And Balaam's whipping him, and the donkey runs him into the wall on the side of the road. And then finally the donkey turns and talks to him, right? The donkey speaks. And so then Balaam's eyes are opened. He sees the angel of the Lord, and the angel of the Lord says, basically, you better say what I tell you to say or you're going to die. And so he goes, right? And 3 times he prophesies over Israel as he looks down from the mountain with King Balak. And instead of cursing Israel, he blesses them. And we're going to look at some of the language in that blessing. It's going to be real familiar to the Abrahamic covenant in terms of blessing those who bless and cursing those who curse. It's also one of the foundational messianic prophecies is included in this oracle. And we are introduced to the Antichrist in this oracle, in the second oracle. So, if give me a second here and I'll pull this up. Now, what we're looking at specifically in this first, we're going to look at Numbers 24 twice, but what we're going to look at first is geographically who is the prophet speaking of, or what peoples? Because he's going to talk about judgment in regard to the people that are Israel's enemies. So, give me a second to pull up Numbers 24, and then let's find our thing here. So here's the first one. So again, this is Balaam prophesying over Israel. King Balak is paying him handsomely to curse Israel, and this is what comes out of Balaam's mouth. He says, "How beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwellings, Israel. They stretch out like river valleys, like gardens beside a stream, like aloes the Lord has planted, like cedars beside the water. Water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be by abundant water. His king will be greater than GOG, and his kingdom will be exalted. God brought him out of Egypt. He is like the horns of a wild ox for them. He will feed on enemy nations and gnaw their bones, and he will strike them with his arrows. He crouches, he lies down like a lion or a lioness. Who dares to rouse him? Those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed." And then Balak became furious with Balaam. And so we see exactly what we're talking about here. Balaam says, I can only say what the Lord has told me to say. And so instead of cursings, it's blessings. But we see language out of the Abrahamic covenant being repeated here. Because remember, this is in the context of Israel moving to the promised land. So we're seeing that element fulfilled. And then we also see the Israel being blessed, right? And then we're introduced to, in your translation, it's going to say Agag in verse 7. We're going to pick that up when we get down to GOG. So we'll come back to that. But for now, I want to bump down. We're going to look at some of the nations that are mentioned here. So if we go down to verse 16, or let's go 17. This is the fourth oracle. This is the fourth time that Agag is trying to push Balaam to curse Israel. And this is the final one. Balaam says, "I see him, but not now. I perceive him, but not near. A star will come from Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel. He will smash the forehead of Moab and strike down all the Shephites." And so this is a messianic prophecy, right? The star and the scepter, this is clearly Jesus, right? And so the context of this oracle now is the Messiah. And what is the Messiah doing? He's smashing the forehead of Moab. Well, did Jesus smash the forehead of Moab in his first coming? No. So this is clearly eschatological context. This is the second coming where Jesus is going to do this. But what we're going to key in on here is what people, because Balaam is cursing. He actually is cursing people, just not Israel. He's cursing the people that he was paid to bless. And so let's look at who those people are. The first one is Moab, and the second one is all the Shephites. Shephites is kind of scholars kind of go back and forth on who that refers to. Looking through the Jewish Targums, the Jews, because Numbers is their book, their scholars in antiquity believe that these are the sons of the east, the descendants of Ishmael, okay? The surrounding nations that have enmity towards Israel. Again, like they're up on a mountain looking out to the east over all the surrounding nations of Canaan, and there's Israel moving up through the plain, right? And so Moab is out there, the Shephites, and then there's one more he's going to mention. It's Edom. He says, Edom will become a possession. Seir, which is in Edom, will become a possession of its enemies, but Israel will be triumphant. The one who comes from Jacob will rule. He will destroy the city's survivors. And then one more group. Then Balaam saw Amalek and proclaimed this poem. Amalek was first among the nations, but his future is destruction. So he starts looking around at the surrounding nations and calling them out. And so in the context, this is, not only are these people groups that surround Israel going to afflict Israel over the course of centuries, right, as we're looking forward in history, but ultimately Balaam is looking ahead to the return of Jesus at the end of the age. And who is Jesus going to judge at the end of the age? Specifically Moab, Edom, the sons of the east, or the Ishmaelites, Amalek, the Amalekites. And so geographically speaking, these are the peoples that basically cover the land from modern-day Asia Minor, which is Turkey, down through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, down into Egypt, okay? And so, and as we've been studying, this is a recurring theme in the geography of the people groups mentioned, right? When we're talking about the metallic statue in Daniel 2, right? We have the progression of evil empires, right? Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, they all occupy the same geographical territory. And so we're focused on this area, and this is the specific area that's being lined out for judgment at the return of Jesus. So moving on, Isaiah 25 is our next passage, and it talks about Moab. I don't have time to dive into each of these because we got a long way to go this morning, but I'm just going to list them, each passage, and I've written them down, and it's highlighting which people groups are mentioned in these passages. And again, all these passages are Day of the Lord, the Messiah coming to judge the nations surrounding Israel passages. And so these are the people groups. In Isaiah 25, we have Moab. The book of Obadiah is about Edom. If you remember, the Edomites are the descendants of Esau. Mount Seir is the high place in Esau's territory. And Esau and Jacob, right, there's enmity between Esau and Jacob. In the end, it says that the descendants of Esau, because of how they treated Jacob, specifically like when Israel was carried off into captivity, instead of coming to their defense or even like siding with them, verbally, like they basically applauded their destruction, and God didn't forget that. But the modern territory of Edom, right, is these people to the east of Jerusalem. This is Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia area. And so we look at those people groups today. Are they similar to the people in this oracle, right? Yeah, the same issue exists, right? They are the ancestral, brother of Israel. They're Edomites, and they still have this perpetual hatred for Israel to this very day. It also happen to be Muslim majority nations, right? We're talking about all the nations in the Middle East, and then as we're going to see, that extends across North Africa. So in Ezekiel 25, we have Edom, Teman, Dedan, Philistia, and Gaza. These are Palestinian territories today. The Philistines, you remember, came from the coastland in the southern part of Israel, which is the modern-day Gaza Strip. Places like Ashkelon and Ashdod and Gath, where Goliath was from. And so they're lined out for judgment in Ezekiel 25 at the return of Jesus. In Ezekiel 30, it expands even more. Egypt is named, Cush, which is modern-day Sudan, Put, which is modern-day Libya, Lud, which is modern-day Turkey, Arabia, which encompasses all of Arabia, so that's Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Qatar, the UAE, everybody on that peninsula, and Libya is specifically mentioned. So now the nations marked for judgment at the return of Jesus are extending across North Africa, which again today, these are all of the Muslim majority nations that run across North Africa into Arabia, and we're including Persia, which is Iran, across to Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey, which are, these are all of Israel's modern-day enemies right now, are the ones being named here several centuries before Jesus is on the scene. Zephaniah 2, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Philistia, Cush, and Assyria. So this is all of the nations and the peoples just south of Israel, and then extending again up into the Assyrian Empire. Joel 3, we have Lebanon and Gaza named. Lebanon is the modern home of Hezbollah, who's funded by the Iranians. They have a gigantic stockpile of weapons currently up there, and that's why Israel is currently fortifying the Golan Heights and trying to defend that territory as a buffer. And then Gaza, of course, we have two groups. There's two groups of Palestinians in modern-day Israel. Over in the West Bank, you have one group, and then in the Gaza Strip, you have another group. And they're kind of at odds with each other. Again, this whole idea of them being a divided empire, you can see that in the divisions within the Palestinian peoples amongst the Muslim nations themselves. But yet they're all unified in their hatred for Israel, and they all occupy this ancient land that surrounds them. Isaiah 34, Basra and Edom. This is that territory to the east of Israel, coming up through northern Saudi Arabia and into Jordan. And then Isaiah 63, Edom is named again. And so what we're looking at, modern equivalent-wise, is the modern nations of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and the Palestinian territories. These are all of the specific places marked for judgment at the return of Jesus. And without including the Palestinian territories, that just happens to be 10 nations, 10 modern nations.
Well, Iran is not mentioned.
Yeah, well, they get caught as the fringe of that Assyrian Empire. But the point is that these nations, and this is a span of the Old Testament, right? Where this isn't just like one little chapter in the Old Testament. This is prophecies over the course of several centuries, all naming the same geographical areas and the same people groups, and they're all looking forward to the apocalypse, the Messiah coming and delivering Israel, and they're all naming these same places. And so what I would say is that as we're looking towards an empire that will be headed up by the Antichrist, this empire needs to be based in this geographical area with these people groups that have the same enmity towards Israel that they've always had. It wouldn't really make sense to go, execute judgment on America or Europe, right, in the end times. They're not Israel's problem. Now, this isn't to say that by the time that the Antichrist arrives on the scene that the influence of his empire and his followers won't have penetrated and permeated the nations of the world. Okay? If we're talking about Islam, and that really is the final end times challenge for the church in Israel before Jesus returns, then Islam's already in every country in the world just about, right? And so you see that the Antichrist, he doesn't have control of every nation on the earth. His empire it's primarily made up of 10 nations, right? We know that. But he has followers that are going to be pushing his cause in all the nations of the earth. And so I don't anticipate America converting to Islam and following the Antichrist. But I do anticipate a large contingency of Muslims in the United States at that time who will be pushing his agenda and carrying out persecution right here in our own country. But we also see nations battling against the Antichrist. There are going to be several nations that resist the Antichrist. He doesn't get total control of the world. Who does get control of the world in the end? Jesus, right? It's his kingdom that is established over all the earth. When it talks about, there's some verses in Revelation that kind of give the impression that maybe the Antichrist has control of the whole world. But the word there is the land in the original language, and so it's really talking about he'll have control of all of land. And then remember, we also have hyperbole, right, which is that Middle Eastern exaggerated poetic language. I can give you an example. So with Nebuchadnezzar, when Daniel is addressing Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, "Oh king, you're the head of gold. All the peoples of the earth fear you and obey you." Well, that's actually not true in a literal sense. Like the Eastern nations of like the Orient, like China, these cultures were already established. They didn't even know or care who Nebuchadnezzar was. So the idea that he ruled the whole world and everybody and all peoples obeyed him, that was said of him, but it wasn't literally true. It was just that hyperbole that we use. The same language is used of the Antichrist, and it talks about how he'll rule the nations and the land. It's not that he'll literally rule the whole world. It's that he'll primarily have the land that we're talking about in the context of the Bible, which is the Middle East, right? It's a Jerusalem, Israel-centric book. And then when it talks about the Messiah's kingdom, it uses the word cosmos, which is different than what is used of the Antichrist, because Jesus literally will have control of the entire earth and the universe. It's not hyperbole. All right, so let's wrap up this section. Just the big point that I want to make here is that when you get into studying this topic, people that don't agree with my fairly straightforward conclusions about these people groups being the same as the prophets and at the end, have gone through great lengths to try to explain how the Antichrist will come from Europe and how this empire comprised of these people groups named here is primarily a coalition of European nations. And so they have these migration theories, and they do all these tweaks with the language to try to fit that revived Roman Empire theory into some of these passages. And it gets kind of difficult. They got to do some gymnastics. But they have some good scholars on their side, and they work it all out, and they try to make sense of it. But the reality is that when Ezekiel is speaking to a people group, we have to understand who was this people group and where did they live when Ezekiel was talking to them. Who did Ezekiel understand these people to be? Because it's this people group. They may not be called by the same name a couple thousand years later, but he's identifying this group and this territory geographically and culturally. And so we, thousands of years later down the pipe, need to look to that same region, to that same people group. And that's how we make the criteria for who can fulfill these prophecies, right? So that's the big thing. Let me see what I put down here. In the end, just at the end of this, it's the modern Muslim majority nations surrounding Israel in the Middle East and North Africa that do meet this criteria, and consequently these are the same ancient peoples and nations that comprise the empires of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. And so if we remember from last week, we talked about Daniel 7, we see that fourth beast, that terrifying beast that makes up, that's the Antichrist Empire, when it's described in Revelation 13, it's a composite of the three previous empires, right? It's got a lion's head and bear's feet, and I think the leopard's wings. The bear's feet. And so we see that it's a composite of Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, which means that territorially and people group-wise, the Antichrist Empire is this specific place that we're looking towards. And when Jesus destroys the empire of the Antichrist, he is simultaneously destroying these other empires because they are the ancestors of these ancient peoples occupying the same ancient lands. If you remember in the statue in Daniel 2, the stone that's cut without hands, right? This is Jesus comes and strikes the statue on the feet, and then the entire statue crumbles. The iron, the bronze, or the iron, the silver, the bronze, and the gold, they all are crushed to powder and blown away at the same time. But how can you destroy all these three empires at the same time? It's because it's empire on top of empire on top of empire on the same land, right? It's all focused in the same spot. So when you destroy the final one, you're destroying all of it back through the sands of time, essentially all the way into Babylon. All right, we're going to move on. That is really talking about the kingdom, right? Geographically, where is this kingdom going to be centered? I think that the prophets have been telling the same story the whole time, right? And we keep pointing out these same people groups, and when we look at it today, it makes a lot of sense. We're going to move on to the Antichrist himself, variously known as the little horn, as GOG, and also as the Assyrian. There's some other passages, like in Daniel 11, where he's referred to as the king of the north, these other prototypes and foreshadows, but we're going to focus on these three this morning. And primarily, we're going to focus on where does he come from. We're looking at geographically, where does this person come from, okay? So that when people are saying, oh, Donald Trump is the Antichrist, or the Pope is the Antichrist, we're like, well, where does he come from? Does he meet the criteria that we see in here? Because this person has been mentioned all throughout the prophets and the Old Testament. And we have a lot of information.
I have a comment.
Yes.
The influence of Islam is such a great, the media is not telling us. Like when the migration of, 10 years ago, when they went all over Europe and took almost Germany and all the Scandinavian countries, I mean, that influence, it's not done with. You know how much money Saudi Arabia is investing on all European and Western countries? Billions of dollars. So they have influence. They're not going to take over. But their influence is so big, including this just past week. The United Nations condemned Israel because they tried to explode their nuclear power. So they condemned Israel. Why? Not because Western hate Israel, because the influence of Islam in those Western countries is so big. They're trying to influence them even at the United Nations.
Absolutely.
It's amazing.
Yeah. So yeah, again, we're taking these ancient prophecies and we're seeing seeing them perpetuated throughout history and now coming to kind of a culmination in our time. All right, the little horn. The little horn is mentioned in two places. It's back-to-back in Daniel 7 and in Daniel 8. And so a review of Daniel 7, where we're introduced to the little horn, we see that 10 kings rise to power in the final kingdom. Then an 11th king, a little horn, uproots 3 of these kings and takes control of the empire. What Daniel 7 reveals to us is that the Antichrist will forcibly unify a divided group of nations. Forcibly unify a divided group of nations. So if we look at the Muslim majority nations that occupy the territory of all these peoples we just looked at, you're like, how are you going to bring them together? Their biggest downfall is that they're not united. They can't get it together. They've got all this, we refer to it as sectarian violence, right? You've heard that in the news for the last 20 or 30 years. And so who's going to unite all these Muslim nations? Well, we've seen the Mahdi, right? Our Antichrist. There's been several people who have tried to unite the Muslim nations, right? But what's going to set the Mahdi apart is that he's going to have the endorsement of the Muslim Jesus, and I think that's going to be the key that unites these divided peoples, right? That we see this play out the way that I think it will. And so, but he's going to forcibly do it. He's going to war against 3 of these nations and overpower 3 of their kings in order to forcibly unite this empire. Daniel 8. So a quick review of Daniel 8. This is a great story. This is the Medes and the Persians, who are described as a ram with one horn being bigger than the other, come from the east and conquer the Middle East and North Africa. Then Greece, described as a goat with a prominent horn, like a unicorn, sweeps across from the west and conquers the Medes and the Persians. And this Greek empire is divided into 4 kingdoms after the death of Alexander the Great. One of the kingdoms is called the Seleucid dynasty, which ruled from modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, into parts of Iraq.
Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire, right? So this is, prior to that though, this is just after the Greek Empire. So the Seleucid dynasty, which is primarily Turkey, Syria, Iraq, out of that dynasty comes a little horn, right? So we just saw a little horn in Daniel 7. Now we're seeing a little horn again in Daniel 8. Now, here's the issue. Some teachers will say, well, the little horn in Daniel 7 isn't the same as the little horn in Daniel 8. And I'm going, well, that doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't it be? They say, well, the little horn in Daniel 7 comes out of the Roman Empire, right? But the little horn in Daniel 8 clearly comes out of the Greek Empire. Well, if we get rid of the Roman theory, now we're talking about the same person, okay? And so looking at where does the little horn come from, because what Daniel does is it starts out with the big picture, and it starts zeroing in as it moves through the prophecies and gets very, very detailed as to where he comes from and what he will do. And so out of the Seleucid dynasty rises a little horn. And so historically we have a character named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is probably the greatest prototype predecessor of the end times Antichrist in all of history. Much of what is written in Daniel 11, he did. Okay, he is not the final Antichrist, as many preterists or amillennialists would point to and say, oh, Antiochus already fulfilled these prophecies. He is a foreshadow. And he is a poor man's version of the final Antichrist. But nonetheless, he's a very important character for us to understand, because what Daniel 8 reveals to us is that the Antichrist will come from the same geographical area once ruled by Antiochus. Okay, so if we're looking at Antiochus Epiphanes, where did he come from? Where did he rule? Because this is where the Antichrist is going to come from. And it's actually very specific. You can look him up and see where he ruled from. And if you are familiar, right, we're studying the book of Acts, right? And where was that first church that moved out of Jerusalem? It was in Antioch. Yeah, Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey. Well, Antioch was named after Antiochus' father, who was the previous king. Antioch, Antiochus, right? And so that city was named after him. So then there's also Antioch in Pisidia, right, which is up in the Galatian region, or just outside of Galatia, also in modern Turkey. And so when we're really zeroing in on where is Daniel trying to show us that the Antichrist is going to come from, we see that Antiochus came from what is now modern-day Turkey. He ruled over Turkey, Syria, and then eventually he extended down into Egypt and things like that, just like the Antichrist will. So that's the first one. Okay, so that's the little horn that we find in Daniel 7 and 8 comes from modern-day Turkey, Syria area. The next one is GOG. We're going to jump back to Numbers 24 real quick. It said, water will flow from his buckets, that's Israel, and his seed will be by abundant water. His king, Jesus, will be greater than Agag, and his kingdom will be exalted. Now, real quick Hebrew lesson, and Debbie will back me up on this one. Hebrew is written from right to left. I think they were probably left-handed, so they didn't smear as they wrote. And they didn't have any vowels in the Hebrew language. And so the word that they're trying to translate would be two G's, right? And so they're, based on context, they're trying to figure out what word they should put in there. And so what we see, and I'm going to flip around and write the way we're used to here, but one option is this, is Agag, right? They put an A before both G, right? Because Agag was one of the kings in that region. But another option is GOG. And this is the ancient Jewish teachers understood this should be translated as God. And when we look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, and Ezekiel is prophesying, the Lord says, "Son of man," he's talking to Ezekiel, he says, "Prophesy, turn to the north, face Gog and Magog, prophesy against him." Okay, this is it says, you are the one that has been spoken of old, right? And basically in this prophecy is saying, we've been talking about you from the beginning. You're part of the prophecy. You actually go all the way back into Genesis 3. You're the seed of the serpent, right? Is ultimately the Antichrist. And so it's been translated mostly as Agag. I think that's a mistake. Okay? Because what's the context of this passage? The context of the passage is the Messiah and him crushing the enemies of Israel. And again, this is language straight out of Genesis 3:15, right? You'll bruise his heel, but you'll crush your head. And we see this term for crushing over and over throughout the Messianic prophecies. The Messiah is going to crush the serpent. Debbie?
It might also be a comparison because the Israelite, when Balaam gives his prophecy, the Israelite army had just conquered Agag. And Agag is this huge, giant, tall guy that sleeps in a 10-foot bed.
Yes.
And so if he's like the greatest, in their minds, enemy that could be around. So if the Jewish guy can beat him, so it might be that.
Yeah, and you can see how the translators would maybe lean towards that. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, Agag is a foreshadows who, though, right? He's another prototype of the Antichrist. That's why John says in one of his epistles that, Antichrist is coming, but there's already been many, right? And there's some right now. Goliath is a prototype of the Antichrist. David in many ways is the end times church standing up. So there's just been so many examples, even like Gideon against the Midianites, right? The peoples of the east. God whittles down their army to just 300 people, and there's 180,000, and consequently they're Ishmaelites, and he takes crescent jewelry off of them. And that's a foreshadow of Armageddon, because what happened to the Midianites? They turned on themselves, right? That's exactly what God's going to do to the Antichrist armies at the Battle of Armageddon, and we'll see that in Ezekiel 38 and 39 if you read through that. They turn on themselves. Everyone's sword turns on each other, right? And then Israel gathers the spoils. What is the symbol of Islam?
Crescent.
It's the crescent. That's exactly what they took off the Midianites. And so you see these are the same peoples, in the same story repeated over and over, but on a smaller scale, foreshadowing the big story at the end of history with the same people in the same places, and the same enmity, right? It's all coming to a conclusion. And it just makes so much sense, right? So what we're doing here is, I need to establish that GOG has been mentioned way back in Numbers, okay? Yes, I can see why they translate it as Agag, but really in the context of the return of Jesus, GOG is who is being prophesied against, ultimately. Agag is just a foreshadow of GOG. And so in Ezekiel 38 and 39, God says to Ezekiel, he says, "Son of man, face GOG of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Persia, Cush, and Put are with them," that's Gog's army, "Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the remotest parts of the north along with all its troops. Many peoples are with you." This is I pulled a couple verses out of here. This is specifically, again, because we're after where does this army come from? Where does GOG come from? So I pulled out the names, right? Geographically, you can go into any Bible atlas, and you'll see that GOG, or Magog, right? GOG is the name of the leader. Magog is the territory. These first names are all right in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Not up in Russia, right? Some people think, one of those parts of the north. Yeah, maybe there will be people up there that come to join him, but Magog is squarely in modern-day Turkey. Along with, let's see the names here, Meshech and Tubal, both in modern-day Turkey. And then it says that Persia, which is Iran, Cush and Put, which is Sudan and Libya, are with them. That's Gog's army. And so now we're looking at, if you're looking at the points of the compass, you've got Turkey out to Iran and down into North Africa, right? This is the same geographical area that was conquered by Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, and now the Antichrist. It's all the same, right? And so this is who God is calling out. It says this is the Antichrist, and these are the people that are with him, right? And he's just naming all the same places. Very consistent. It says Gomer with all its troops. This is in the eastern side of modern-day Turkey, and Beth Tagorma from the remotest parts of the north, and that may be up into like Azerbaijan or Armenia, right?
Chechnya.
But just right next to, yeah, if you look at the Balkans right now, Islam has just flooded the Balkan nations, and this is probably a reference to that. Think about it from Ezekiel's perspective. He's in Israel, right? And to him, the remotest parts of the north, the Balkans would be about as far as you get, and so, yeah, it's very consistent. And then we have Persia, Sudan, Libya. These are all the same places. So that's what makes up Gog's army, right? If you have a chance, just read Ezekiel 38 and 39. It's actually a very good description of modern-day Israel. It describes the Battle of Armageddon. And I don't have time to go through it, but part of this whole thing is a lot of people that have different viewpoints they have to argue against Gog being the Antichrist, and this isn't the Battle of Armageddon. The parallels between the Battle of Armageddon and the results of that battle and Ezekiel in 38 and 39 are overwhelming. It's clearly the same battle. It's clearly the same Antichrist. It's clearly the same army, same event. The Bible just consistently retells the same story. It's not coming up with all these different ones that we got to chase around. It's just been telling the same story the whole time. The last person we're going to look at is the Assyrian. Okay, in Isaiah, there's a recurring theme that has to do with the king of Assyria, but in the context of the coming Messiah. And so, in the contemporary time of the prophet, Assyria was the empire that was in power, and they were threatening Israel, right? That was the big threat of their day. And you'll remember, eventually the northern kingdom is carried off by the Assyrians. But within this story, these prophecies pop up about the Messiah. So you'll remember from like Isaiah 7, it's the prophecy of the virgin birth. Isaiah 9, right, is the one we read every Christmas. A son, a child will be given to us. The extent of his kingdom will be, everlasting. It's just, these are our most famous passages. These are all in the context of the Assyrian Empire threatening Israel. And then we get these messianic prophecies where you see the Messiah delivering Israel from who? The Assyrian. Where is Assyria? Modern-day Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iran. Okay? Same geographic area. The Assyrian king, whether it's Sennacherib or right, whether it's any of those kings, they all occupied that same territory. They all represent the Antichrist. Okay, and so when we're looking at the book of Isaiah, we see that the messianic prophecies come forth in that context, detailing how the Messiah will deliver Israel and destroy the Assyrian. So the Assyrian is another title for the Antichrist, and it also gives away where he comes from. This has obvious parallels to the Antichrist and the day of the Lord. Regarding our study, it is from the ancient Assyrian Empire that our Antichrist prototype will emerge. This is consistent with every other passage we have looked at so far. Ancient Assyria included modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. And after conquering Israel, it extended down into Jordan and Egypt. The ancient capital of Assyria was Nineveh, which is modern-day Mosul, which is located right in the middle of Iraq. So, very consistent. The next passage we're going to look at, and I wish we had time to go through all this, is Micah 5. Now, Micah 5 is, right, this is a messianic passage, right? This is the prediction that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, right? So we have a very famous verse in here. However, before that, or right after the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem is predicted in Micah 5:2, the following verses, we see that the Assyrian is depicted as being defeated by the Messiah on Israel's behalf, causing Israel to dwell forevermore in safety. And again, the Assyrian is a prototype of the Antichrist, and the ultimate context of the prophecy is the return of Jesus. And so Micah 5, the Assyrian, just another name for the Antichrist. And so this is typical of Jewish prophecy, right? We went all the way back in our very first session where we were talking about this, is that, you have the immediate context of the prophet's day, but in God's genius, He's also seeing the very end in the same thing and giving you a picture of what's going to happen and where it's going to happen and who it's going to happen with. So in conclusion, the repeated and consistent message of the Old Testament is that the Antichrist will invade Israel from the north in the last days. He will come from the region of modern-day Turkey. This also happens to be the seat of the historical Islamic Caliphate, or the Ottoman Empire, which we talked about at length last week. The coalition of nations that he will lead are made up of the anti-Semitic nations of the Middle East and North Africa. When Jesus returns, it is this leader and these nations that are specifically marked for judgment as Jesus rescues Israel and establishes his worldwide rule from Jerusalem. Practical eschatology. Should we be looking to Europe for the Antichrist and his coalition of nations? I would say no. Or should we understand that the same story about the same Middle Eastern and North African nations has been told from the beginning? The Lord has given us great detail with precise geographical locations over and over. Israel and the church will face their greatest challenge in history against the modern Muslim-majority nations prior to the return of Jesus. We must do all that we can to educate ourselves about Islam and be prepared to endure as our Lord commanded us.
You said it. One thing about Assyria, God punished them in Isaiah, says it will be like a dust. And if you look at Assyria, look at me, I'm in America. All Assyrian are Australia, Europe, South America, Scandinavia, they're all scattered, no Assyrian. When I left Iraq in 1970, there were 30% Christian Assyrian. Now it's 2%. What that tells you. And if you go to North Iraq, Kurdistan, now, you know what it says, sign? Welcome to the cradle of civilization, Kurdistan.
Yeah.
It was Assyria, it was Mesopotamia, correct?
Correct.
But now it's Kurdistan. So they use the name of Assyria, but the Assyrian nation is dead. The only people who trust in Jonah the prophet, when he went to preach the living God to them, they accepted God. And through Thomas the disciple, they accepted Jesus as their Lord. So the remaining of Assyrian, they are nothing but scattered all over the world like dust. But what the Muslim, the Kurdistan, which are Islam, like Turkish, like Persian, they're all Muslims. Our nation is Syria because the Syrian Empire was there through the centuries.
That's fascinating history. Thank you. So what's next? Coming up, we got 2 weeks left, and so next week what we're going to look at, we're going to kind of shift gears here. We're going to review the biblical feasts of the Lord, which is our Jewish calendar. These are things like Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles. And so we're going to look at all of these that are outlined because they have eschatological significance. And so these appointed times not only foreshadow the events the advents of Jesus, but they give us a basic timeline for us to work from. So, for example, Jesus died on Passover specifically. Okay, there are specific events in the future that we're looking forward to that are foreshadowed by specific feasts, such as the Feast of Tabernacles, and we would anticipate fulfillments on those specific days, just like at his first advent. So we're going to get into that next week. It's pretty fascinating, and we'll get acquainted with our Jewish calendars. Thanks for coming, and see you next time.